What is hopeful theism? We're talking with philosophy professor Fidel Arnecillo today. Check this out. This is TenOnReligion. Hey peeps, it's Dr. B with TenOnReligion. If you like religion and philosophy content, one thing I really need you to do is to smash that sub button because it really helps out the channel. New episodes are posted about every 2 weeks at noon, U.S. Pacific Time, so drop me some views. I interviewed Dr. Fidel Arnecillo, who is taught at Cal State San Bernardino, Cal Poly Pomona, and a number of other institutions in Southern California about hopeful theism. Let's get into it. Hello, we are here with Dr. Fidel Arnecillo, who teaches philosophy at California State University in San Bernardino. Fidel, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good.
All right. So Fidel has some research on something called hopeful theism, which I felt would be kind of interesting for us to discuss. So we have a few questions for you. But first, I want to get a little bit of background on this idea. What inspired you to write about hopeful theism? I mean, is there some sort of a backstory that precipitated this inquiry?
Okay. I think it has something to do with my dissatisfaction with the triumphalist nature of popular evangelical apologetics. I think that's the one that inspired me to write about hopeful theism. Popular arguments that this apologist use for theism, I consider them to be weak, including classic arguments in natural theology. I don't think they are enough to warrant belief in God's existence. It strikes me that the argumentative or evidential threshold for belief in theism has a high bar. But even if such bar is not met, I do think that theism still makes sense. So that's why I began to think about a different propositional attitude other than belief that might be needed, right? Because in the same way that belief is a weaker propositional attitude than, let's say, knowledge, given that the argumentative or evidential threshold for belief has a lower bar. Hope is a weaker propositional attitude than belief. So I see that, if I rank them, right, so knowledge will be higher, right, and then belief, and then hope.
So you start out, Dr. Arnecillo wrote a paper on this that I read, and that's sort of what precipitated this. In this paper, you start out by relating hopeful theism with hopeful soteriology, or maybe the idea of universal salvation in Christianity. What's the difference between the two?
So it started when I read Michael Ray's paper on it's like his critique of soteriological universalism or hopeful universalism.
Okay.
Michael Ray is a philosopher from Notre Dame, an analytic philosopher, and usually, I don't know if there's even any other analytic philosopher who spend time critiquing universalism, right? As far as I can tell, I think he's probably the only one who has done this. I'm talking about hopeful universalism here. So Michael Ray describes a hopeful universalist as one who hopes that soteriological universalism is true, but does not believe that it is true.
Okay.
So prominent theologians such as, I think, Karl Barth, Karl Rahner, right, and Hans Urs von Balthasar. I think they're often described as hopeful universalist or hopeful inclusivist. And with that in mind, I define hopeful theism. So what I did is that I use raise a sense of hopeful as applied to universalism, and I apply it to theism. So a hopeful theist is one who hopes that God exists, but does not believe that God exists.
Okay,
I don't know if that's
so
adequate.
one of your main definitions is what you just said. So a hopeful theist is one who hopes God exists, but does not maybe need to believe that God exists. Um, for some people, they would be having trouble understanding that. Is there any way you could unpack that a little bit more?
Okay. Let me see if this one will work. The way I will unpack it here. So we have different attitudes toward propositions. So propositions, you can either know it, believe it, or hope for it, right, to be true. We can know that a proposition is true. We can believe that a proposition is true, or we can hope that a proposition is true. And I think that certain level of credence, right, is required in order for a proposition to be reasonable, or in order for a proposition to be reasonably knowable, right, in order for a proposition to be reasonably believable, or in order for a proposition to be reasonably, I'll use the word, I know there's no such thing as word as hopeable, but I'll just use that, right?
Okay.
Reasonably hopeable. While, I am not willing to grant that theism is reasonably believable, given the lack of just adequate evidence, right? Lack of adequate evidence or arguments to make it believable. I am willing to grant that we can reasonably hope for theism to be true.
Okay. I mean, so you feel that it's really important to help people understand why believing and hoping are two different things.
Yes. Why? Because I think people need to understand that so-called evidences or arguments for God's theism, for God's existence, they're not as strong as how apologists, like to make them appear. And I really do think that it is dishonest or even arrogant, right, to actually make them appear in that way.
Okay, interesting. So let me switch topics because there's something that I found quite interesting from your paper. You provide examples about the idea of scientific evidence, especially in regard to physicists in physics, and the idea of the multiverse. But then you contrast that with philosophical evidence, and so it seems like to me there are a lot of religious adherents in general, and maybe Christians in particular, that seem to conflate the two. So, why are scientific and philosophical evidence different from each other?
Okay. Um, at least in the paper, I am following my two colleagues here at Cal Poly Pomona, who wrote a paper on existence problems, right? And they made a distinction between what we call a scientific existence problem and philosophical existence problem. So they claimed that um, when something is somewhat tractable, right, at least empirically, then it can be qualified as a scientific existence problem. On the other hand, if something is intractable, right, then we consider that to be something like philosophical problem, right, a philosophical existence problem. Now, when we look at, let's say, the multiverse, so the question might be, in what sense existence problems related to the multiverse, right? In what sense is that different from God, right? Given that there's really no actual evidence for the existence of the multiverse, right? Probably for the most part, both God and the multiverse are mere postulates. But how come science somehow takes multiverse seriously, but not God, right? As an object of scientific inquiry, and that's because uh, inquiries about multiverse, at least we can, it's somewhat tractable, right? We can make some kind of the predictions that, let's say, if there is such a thing as a multiverse, then we can expect such and such thing, whatever that is, right? But that's something that we can't really do with God, right? If we say, if we assume that God exists, we should expect such and such. What can we expect really, right? Of course, some people might say that the universe will be designed and stuff like that. But I think looking at it looks like science can independently explain, right? Why the universe is seemingly designed, right? Without really assuming that there is a God involved, right? On the other hand, when it comes to multiverse, it might be a reasonable naturalistic assumption, right? That if you want to claim that science is somehow capable, right, of at least theoretically speaking, capable of explaining everything, right, without appealing to the supernatural, right? Then it looks like the multiverse theory is going to be, a possible, right, scientific theory that one can use, right? That it's still within the realm of science, right? Unlike God. I don't know if I'm answering the question here.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, this is related to my next question where, you talk about evidence in your paper, stating that evidence still matters, which is an important claim to make. But then after I was reading it, I was kind of wondering, well, which evidence still matters and why?
Okay. Now, so for me, the evidence that we find in, or the arguments that we find in natural theology, it is still useful, right? I'm not saying that we should discard them. So in a way, I'm probably making a more modest approach to apologetics, right? When I look at those, evidences given in, the arguments for, the cosmological, I'm just referring to the a posteriori proofs for God's existence
Okay,
here,
sure,
right?
sure.
Let's say cosmological proof, teleological proof. I think that they're still valuable, but they're just not enough to warrant belief in God's existence. But they can still warrant hope, right? Because I think that there's a difference between hoping that Santa Claus exists, right, and hoping that God exists. I think it's more reasonable for one to hope that God exists, right, than to hope that Santa Claus exists. So that means that there's something about theism that is still epistemically superior, right, to that of belief in the existence of Santa Claus. And I think natural theology, right, can provide us a way um, to justify the epistemic superiority, right, of theism over the belief in Santa Claus. And so I think evidence still
Okay,
matters,
okay.
apologetics still matters, but I want to actually use them in a more modest way.
So does hopeful theism have any advantages over other ways of maybe thinking about God?
Um, I think hopeful theism can be considered as probably more intellectually honest,
Okay.
right, and a more intellectually humble way of a more intellectually humble propositional attitude, right, or attitude toward the belief, toward the claim that God exists, right. So that might be its advantage. I think it recognizes our limits, epistemic limitations. Um, yeah, so I think it just it has more sensitivity,
Okay.
right, to the kind of the epistemic predicament that we have.
So let me throw you one sort of a curveball here to sort of start to wrap things up here. We're going to have a little
Okay.
fun with Dr. Arnecillo here in a second. So, is the purpose of hopeful theism directed only towards a particular metaphysical understanding of God? You don't write about this in your paper, but do you feel this might be helpful for other understandings of God, which might not fall under our standard understandings, like a process theology understanding of God, Paul Tillich, God is the ground of being, and then the word God is a very flexible term, and it's obviously used in a lot of other religious traditions other than Christianity. Whether we're talking about Islam or Judaism or Hinduism or even Chinese traditions and so on and so forth. So, is hopeful theism, does that only work for a particular like Christian understanding of God, or would it work for other ways that people use the word God?
Okay. You said a while ago that we're going to have fun,
Yeah. Oh.
right? But I doubt that my answer will. I doubt that my answer will actually be a fun thing because it might be a boring answer. Because I think for now, at least, I'm only concerned with a more generic kind of theism.
I,
But I don't know if I don't. I'm not even sure if it will have implications for other forms of theism, like in process theology. So I haven't really thought of it. I haven't really thought about other conceptions of God, right? So this is more like a typical analytic philosophy of religion, right? Just simply referring to this generic concept of God with a capital G, right? Typically defined as or typically described or referred to as classic theism,
okay.
right? Even though I'm not a classic theist,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Well, if you're not a classic theist, then why are you doing this? I mean, what's the
Oh,
point of relating to a classic theistic understanding of God, and then are you trying to redefine it, or?
no. It's just more like, a majority of people who believe in God, at least in the West, right, are classic
Okay,
theists.
okay,
And so in a way, I'm trying to offer probably a much more intellectually honest and intellectually humble way, right, of talking about theism,
okay.
right? That when you say that you believe in God, right? Is that even an adequate way of actually even talking about it, like belief, right? Because when I say I believe that presidential candidate X, right, will win the election, right? I have to have some reasons why I believe that, right? But I don't know if we can say something like that when it comes to when you say I believe that God exists, right? Are there adequate reasons for believing it? And for me, I wanted to tell let's say my evangelical brothers and sisters, let's say, right, that's just not an adequate propositional attitude.
Okay.
Uh, I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I mean, we're sort of in the line of. I'm just thinking philosophically, when people talk about God, and you go back in Christian history, you think of Augustine, and then Anselm, and then Aquinas, and then and a number of other full, you made Kant, and so on and so forth. And so we're sort of in that trajectory that this conversation takes place. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, yeah,
Okay,
that's correct.
okay, okay.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that
But I know there might be, but I'm assuming that can still be applicable, right, even to non-classical concepts of God, right? That we can only hold on to that that we can only be hopeful, right? That whatever we say about that God is true, but we can never really say that technically we believe it, right? Because I just don't think there's enough evidence to say. So even if you apply that to process theism, let's say, right? Whatever you say about God, they're just mostly speculative, right? And there will be lacking any kind of direct evidence to even prove that, right? Because when I'm thinking of let's say claims that like existential claims such as eggs exist or God exist, right? I treat that more as a scientific problem, right? I don't know if from a purely philosophical standpoint, right, I can claim that God exists, given that God is not accessible to we cannot sensibly perceive God, let's say, right? I think it makes sense to say X exists, right, in the context of conversations where we can identify, right, ostensibly identify, let's say, right, whatever it is that we're talking about to be existing. But that's something that we're lacking when it comes to God. So so even with non-classical theism, we are still doomed, right, to somehow speculate the whole time, right? And so trying to pin it down, what exactly we even mean by God, right, seems
Yeah,
elusive,
that's
right?
and maybe that was really the point of my question is right. I mean, how do we
Right.
even, we have so many different conceptions. So
Mhm.
the strongest claim we can make is not God exists or even that we believe God exists. The strongest claim we can make based on the available evidence is hope.
Yeah, I can only hope that God exists.
So,
But I think you also wanted me to ask the questions about the ethics of it, right?
well, yeah, I mean
Uh,
that was the end point here to wrap things up is how does ethics fit into the discussion and
mhm.
how does a hopeful theist live their life? What does that look like?
Yeah. So I don't think practically speaking, I don't think there's really any difference between how someone with a doxastic attitude, right, toward theism and someone with a non-doxastic attitude toward theism, like the one who's simply hoping. I don't think there's really any difference in how they're going to live their life, right? So if I hope that God exists, then I should be acting as if there is a God, right? Because that's the nature of my hope, right? Because um, I cannot really say that I hope that God exists without the kind of disposition, right, to behave as if I'm hoping that God exists. So the same thing with the one who actually believes in God, right? So practically speaking, I don't think that they're actually going. I don't think that they're supposed to be different, right, in how they're going to live their life.
Okay,
So
all
this
right.
is much more like some kind of a theoretical difference between the two, right? Someone who believes in God, of course, must have some kind of a disposition, right, to act as if he believes, right? So the same thing with the one who hopes that God exists. He or she needs to act in such a way that exhibit, right, that hope that there is a God.
Is there? I mean, now that you said that, I was just thinking off the top of my head right now. It is. I didn't think
Mhm.
about this earlier, but I mean, is there any relation to that and Pascal's wager, or is hopeful theism very
Yes.
different from Pascal's wager?
There might be that's actually a good point to make. I think it's very much related to that
Okay.
in some sense, right? Because Pascal, um, um, he approached the wager, right, with not really having any knowledge of whether God exists or not, right?
Right.
Because we
Right.
cannot
Right.
know, because God is supposedly like infinitely incomprehensible, right, for Pascal. So either God exists or not, we don't really know which exactly is the case, right? And then you just have to make a choice, right? So yeah, so I think it has a lot of relation to Pascal's wager.
Yeah, some similarities. So
Yeah.
very, very interesting. Well, we hope to see and hear more about you developing hopeful theism and see what comes of it. So thank you very much for joining us today, Dr. Arnecillo.
Yeah, thank you, Dr.
Okay.
V.
So what do you think about our convo? Leave a comment below and let me know what you think. Until next time, stay curious. If you enjoyed this, support the channel in the link below. Please like and share this video and subscribe to this channel. This is TenOnReligion.